They used to tell us that every house has someone living behind its walls, besides the family who pays for it. I always thought that was just something my grandmother said to make sure I went to sleep on time. Then, one ordinary night, I woke up, unable to move, felt fingers close around my hair and pull, and heard something breathing slowly against the back of my neck. Patient, unhurried, like it wanted me to know exactly where it was. When I finally screamed and my grandmother came running, she didn't tell me it was a nightmare. She asked me if he pulled my hair, like she already knew. Stay until the end, because what that presence was doing in our house that night was nothing close to what any of us believed for years afterward. If stories like this find their way under your skin, subscribe and tell me in the comments whether your own family ever kept something behind the stove. In our house, in the village of Verbelozy, on the low bank of the Uzhanka river, we called him the Domovoi, and my grandmother Uzhanka spoke of him the way other people speak of an elderly relative who lives in the back room and doesn't come out much anymore, but whose presence you never forget, because the house simply feels different when he's pleased, and different again when he's not. I was maybe 6 years old the first time I understood we weren't alone in that house. It wasn't a dramatic realization. It came in the form of a sound, a soft, patient knocking from somewhere behind the old clay stove. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 more, always in that pattern, always around the same hour of the night. My grandmother would go still when she heard it, mid-sentence sometimes, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth, and she'd tilt her head like she was listening to a voice only she could translate. Then she'd nod, once, as if agreeing to something, and go back to what she was doing. I asked her once what the knocking meant. She said it meant the house was awake and paying attention. She said the Domovoi lived behind the stove, or under the floorboards near the threshold, depending on which version of the old stories you believed, and that he had been there since before her own grandmother's time, passed down not as an object, but as a presence, moving with the family the way blood moves with a family, generation folded into generation. Every night before bed, she left him something, a heel of bread, a little milk in a saucer she kept just for that purpose, sometimes a pinch of tobacco, if my grandfather had been smoking that day. She did it without ceremony, the way you'd set a plate for someone who was simply late coming home. There were other small rules in that house that I absorbed the way children absorb anything repeated often enough to become invisible. We never swept the floor after dark, because sweeping at night was said to sweep the household's luck, and him, right out the door along with the dust. We never whistled indoors, because a whistle was thought to call something, and no one in that house wanted to find out what. When we moved a piece of furniture, even something as small as a stool, Uzhanka would murmur a short phrase under her breath first, an apology of sorts, because the space behind and beneath things was understood to be his, not ours, and rearranging it without asking was considered a kind of trespass. I didn't think of any of this as strange while I was living inside it. It only became strange later, when I tried to describe my childhood to people who had grown up in houses with no rules like these at all, and watched their faces try politely to make sense of it. I want to be clear about something, because people who don't know these stories tend to imagine a domovoi as some kind of household ghost sweet and harmless, a Slavic Casper tucked behind the furniture. That isn't true, and it never was. He was not a servant. He was not even, strictly speaking, kind. He was the spirit of the house itself, sometimes said to be the spirit of the very first man who built it, or the first ancestor who died within its walls. And like any relative with deep roots in a family, he had preferences, moods, grudges that made no sense to anyone but him. He was known to braid the mane of a horse he favored, tight and neat, a small gift of affection. And he was known, when he disliked someone, to sit on their chest in the night and press down until they woke, gasping, certain that something invisible had been kneeling on them in the dark. That was the part my grandmother never said out loud when I was very young. She let me believe, for a while, that the Domovoi was only ever a comfort, a kind of ancestor watching over us from the shadows. I believed that completely, right up until the night I found out otherwise. I was 8. It was late autumn, the kind of night where the cold comes into the house through the walls themselves, not just the windows. And I remember waking up because I couldn't move. Not couldn't move like your legs asleep. Couldn't move like something was holding me down. A weight pressed flat across my chest, heavy enough that each breath took real effort, like breathing through a wet cloth. I opened my eyes, and the room was the same room it always was. My clothes on the chair, the window with its familiar crack of moonlight, and nothing visible sitting on top of me at all. But I felt fingers, or something like fingers, cold and precise, close around a fistful of my hair near the scalp, and pull. Not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough that I understood it was deliberate. Then, worse than the pulling, I felt breath, something exhaling slowly against the back of my neck, patient, unhurried, the way you'd breathe on the back of someone's neck if you wanted them to know, beyond any doubt, that you were there. I couldn't scream. I want to explain that clearly because it matters. I tried, and nothing came out. My throat simply refused to work, and I lay there in that pressed-down silence for what felt like a very long time, before whatever it was lifted off me all at once, like a hand releasing a cup. And I could move again, and I screamed so loudly my grandmother was in the room before I'd even sat up. She didn't tell me it was a nightmare. That's the detail that has stayed with me my whole life. She didn't reach for the easy comfort a parent usually reaches for. She sat on the edge of my bed, took my face in both her hands, and asked me, very calmly, very seriously, if he had pulled my hair. When I said yes, something crossed her expression that I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Recognition, not surprise. She knew exactly what this was, and worse, she seemed to already understand why. My father, Tadas, was a different kind of person entirely. He'd grown up half in that house and half in the city, and he treated Odarka's rituals the way you'd treat a habit you were fond of but didn't believe in. The bread on the saucer, the murmured words at the threshold, all of it charming, all of it, in his mind, meaningless. When I told him what had happened, he sat on the bed too, on the other side from Odarka, and told me very gently that children sometimes have sleep paralysis, that the mind plays tricks in the dark, that there was no one in the room but me. I remember looking between the two of them, my father's rational, kind, dismissive face, and my grandmother's grave, unsurprised one, and understanding even then that only one of them was actually answering my question. After that night, I could not sleep alone. For nearly 2 years, I slept with a lamp burning low in the corner of my room, and even then I would lie awake, listening for the particular quality of silence that meant something was standing just outside the reach of the light. I stopped wanting to be in any room by myself, even in daylight. The pantry, the barn, my own bedroom during an afternoon nap, because I had the constant, physical sense that I was being watched from somewhere just behind my shoulder, a sensation with no source I could point to, and no way to prove it wasn't just fear feeding on itself. I would spin around sometimes, certain I'd catch something mid-motion, and there would be nothing there but the room, holding its breath along with me. My grandmother never told me it would stop. What she told me, once, was that he only did that, the pressing, the pulling, the breath in the dark, to someone he had a reason to punish or a reason to warn, and that both of those things frightened her more than a simple explanation would have. For a long time after that night, the knocking behind the stove continued, exactly as it always had. 3 taps, and a pause, and 2 more. Faithful as a heartbeat. And in a strange way, that rhythm became the only thing that let me sleep at all, because it meant he was still there, still doing what he'd always done, still, in some sense, keeping the shape of the house the way it had always been kept. I hated him, and I needed him in the same breath, which is a confusing thing to carry when you're 8 years old and have no one to explain it to you, except an old woman who spoke about spirits the way other people speak about the weather. Then, the spring I turned 10, the knocking stopped. Not gradually, not fading out over weeks the way you might imagine. One night it was there, the same as it had been my whole life, and the next night it simply wasn't, and the night after that, and the one after that. I remember lying in bed, straining to hear it, the silence behind the stove pressing on my ears the way the weight had once pressed on my chest, and thinking, absurdly, that I missed it. My grandmother noticed before anyone said a word about it out loud. I watched her go to the stove one evening, set down the saucer of milk as she always did, and stand there afterward with her hand flat against the warm clay wall, waiting, the way you wait for someone to answer a door you already suspect is empty behind it. She did not relax after that. If anything, the silence made her more anxious than the pressing and the pulling ever had. Within days, she was leaving offerings twice a day instead of once, murmuring the old words at the threshold longer than usual, tucking little bundles of dried herbs into the corners of the room near the stove, things I had never seen her do before, not even after the night he pinned me down. When I asked her why she was so afraid of quiet, she said something I didn't understand until much later. She said a Domovoi who is angry will let you know. A Domovoi who has gone silent has usually stopped being able to speak at all. Small things began going wrong almost immediately, the way small things do in a house that has, according to my grandmother, lost its watchman. One of our hens died overnight, with no mark on her and no reason anyone could find. A batch of bread Uzhanka had made 100 times before came out of the oven wrong, sour and collapsed, as if something in the process had simply refused to work. My father's good pocket knife went missing from the shelf, where it always sat, and turned up, days later, buried at the bottom of the flour bin, which made no sense to anyone, but which Uzhanka received without a flicker of surprise, only a tightening around her mouth. My father's patience, meanwhile, was running out in the opposite direction. He'd tolerated the bread on the saucer for years as a harmless old habit, but watching his mother's fear deepen by the day over what he still insisted was nothing, bad luck, a run of coincidences, an old woman's superstition compounding on itself, began to genuinely frustrate him. One evening, after the second ruined batch of bread and a week of Uzhanka barely sleeping, he took the saucer of milk off the floor by the stove, poured it down the sink in front of her, and told her, not unkindly but firmly, that this had to stop, that feeding an empty house wasn't going to fix a broken oven or a sick hen, and that all it was doing was frightening a 10-year-old for no reason. Uzhanka didn't argue with him. She simply looked at the empty saucer in his hand and said, very quietly, that he had just done something he couldn't take back. 3 days later, our second hen died, and the milk in the cellar turned overnight in the middle of a cold spring when nothing should have spoiled that fast. And my father, for the first time in my memory, didn't say a word about superstition. He just stood in the cellar doorway, looking at the ruined milk for a long time before he went back upstairs. That was when Uzhanka finally told me what she actually believed was happening, sitting me down at the kitchen table with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for far older listeners. She said the knocking hadn't stopped because he had left us. Spirits like ours, she said, tied to a family and a hearth, the way ours was tied to the Domovoi, do not simply leave. They are drawn away. Sometimes, if something belonging to another household, another hearth entirely, is brought into the home uninvited. An object like that carries its own claim with it, its own old attachments, and if it's strong enough, it can pull a house spirit out of place, the way a magnet pulls a needle off its true direction. Not gone, but caught somewhere it doesn't belong, unable to reach us, unable to warn us, unable even to make the small sounds that told us he was still doing his work. I remember asking her, very carefully, if she knew where such an object might have come from, and I remember the exact moment her expression changed, because she was looking, without quite meaning to, past me, toward the hallway that led to my father's workroom, toward the crate of things he'd brought back 3 weeks earlier from the old Marchenka house at the far edge of the village, the house that had stood empty since its last owner died alone there the previous winter, the house no one in Verbelozy would set foot in anymore, except, apparently, my father, who did not believe in such things and had simply seen a crate of good tools going to waste. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the old fear crawling back up my spine, the sensation of being watched that I hadn't fully felt in almost 2 years, returning all at once, sharper now, because this time I understood, or thought I understood, that there might genuinely be a reason for it. Sometime past midnight I got up anyway, because staying in bed with that feeling was somehow worse than moving through the dark house to do something about it. I went to my father's workroom with a candle I wasn't supposed to be carrying, and I went through that crate piece by piece, tools and rags and small useless objects, until my hand closed around something at the very bottom that didn't feel like a tool at all. It was small enough to fit in my palm, a carved wooden figure, worn smooth by handling, shaped roughly like a seated man with his knees drawn up, the kind of object you'd recognize instantly if you'd grown up the way I had, because Uzhanka kept one almost exactly like it, though older and darker with age, tucked in the corner behind our own stove. This one felt wrong in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't grown up hearing these stories. Not evil, not menacing, just deeply, wrongly out of place. The way a word feels wrong when it's spoken in someone else's accent inside your own mouth. The moment my fingers closed around it, the candle flame beside me guttered sideways, as if a door had opened somewhere, though every door in the house was shut. And in that instant, holding it, I understood something that reordered everything I thought I knew about the night I was 8 years old, pinned to my own bed with a weight on my chest and breath on the back of my neck. That hadn't been cruelty. It had been urgency. Some house spirits pin down the people they intend to harm, yes. But some, my grandmother told me later, pin down the people they're trying to keep still, long enough to make them notice something. The way you might grip a child's shoulders hard enough to bruise, if it meant stopping them from stepping into traffic. I had spent 2 years hating him for something that had never been about hating me at all. Uzhanka's ritual for calling a displaced Domovoi home was not elaborate, not the kind of dramatic ceremony you'd expect from a story. It was small, precise, almost domestic in its plainness, which somehow made it more unsettling rather than less. It had to happen at the threshold of the house, at the hour between night and morning when, she said, doors of every kind stand a little more open than usual. She set the wooden figure from the Uzhanka house on a cloth by the door, alongside our own family's figure, side by side, and she began speaking the old words. An invitation, not a command, because you cannot order a spirit home. You can only ask. The same words, she told me, that every generation of our family had used when moving to a new house. An offer of welcome, an acknowledgement of what the house owed him, and his place within it, restated aloud so there could be no confusion about where he belonged. Before she began, Uzhanka made me stand well back from the threshold, near the stove, and told me not to speak no matter what I saw or heard, because a ritual interrupted partway through was worse, she said, than no ritual at all. It would leave both figures suspended between claims, neither one fully welcomed nor fully refused, and that in-between state was the one thing she feared more than open hostility from either spirit. She lit no candles this time, only the low, banked coals in the stove, because, she said, this kind of asking was better done in near dark, the way you'd lower your voice to say something delicate to a person who was still deciding whether to trust you. My father, to his credit, said nothing this time, though I could see how much it cost him to stand there in silence while his mother knelt at the threshold of her own kitchen. It was midway through the ritual, in the strange, taut quiet after Uzhanka's words, and before anything had visibly changed, that something did change. Not the gentle response she seemed to be hoping for, but a sudden, violent draft that blew through the closed room and knocked both wooden figures off the cloth, scattering the herbs she'd laid beside them, as though something had swept an arm across the threshold, in refusal or in panic, we couldn't tell which. Uzhanka froze. For the first time in my life, I saw real uncertainty on her face. The fear of someone who had done everything correctly and still didn't know what was about to happen. It was strange, given how frightened I still was, but something in me moved before I decided to move. I picked up both figures from the floor, our own worn one and the stranger's rougher one, and set them back exactly as she'd placed them. And I said the words myself, the ones I'd just heard her say, my child's voice shaking through them, because it suddenly seemed unbearable to let the ritual fail on the floor between us. I don't fully know why I did it. I think some part of me, after 2 years of fear, simply wanted to be the one who fixed it instead of the one who was frightened by it. The room went still. Then, faint but unmistakable, from somewhere behind the stove, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. It took Uzhanka 3 more nights of quiet questioning around the village before she pieced together whose figure it truly was. And the answer was not what either of us expected. The Marchenka house had not simply lost its last owner to death the winter before. The family line itself had ended there. No children, no relatives left to inherit either the house or whatever lived inside it. And a Domovoi with no family to belong to does not simply vanish. He lingers, ownerless, in the walls of a house that will eventually be torn down or left to rot around him, waiting for a claim that will never come. My father hadn't stolen an object from a hostile spirit at all. He had, without knowing it, carried a homeless one into a house that already had its own, and for a while, the two of them had been caught in something between a territorial standoff and a kind of desperate, silent negotiation neither could win. One distracted from his duties, one displaced from his purpose, and our house had suffered quietly in the space between them. Once Uzhanka understood that, the small disasters stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. The hens were fine, the bread rose properly again, my father's tools stayed where he left them, and slowly, over the following weeks, I found I could sit alone in a room again, without that old crawling sense of being watched. Though every so often, in the evening, I would catch myself listening for the knock, the way you listen for a familiar footstep on the stairs. And there was something almost tender in that listening now, where there had only ever been fear before. Uzhanka warned me, near the end of that spring, that the story wasn't finished, though she wouldn't say exactly what she meant by that. She said a Domovoi doesn't simply attach himself to a house. He attaches himself to a family, to the particular thread of people who carry the household forward, and that the bond doesn't necessarily end just because a person eventually leaves the house they grew up in. I didn't understand what she was telling me at the time. I understood it many years later, on an ordinary evening in an apartment 300 kilometers from Verbolozy, in a life my grandmother never lived to see. I was 31. Uzhanka had been gone for almost a decade by then, and the old house in Verbolozy had passed, eventually, out of our hands entirely, sold to strangers after my father's health made it impossible for him to keep it up. I hadn't performed a single one of the old rituals in years, hadn't set out bread, hadn't murmured words at any threshold, hadn't really thought about the Domovoi at all, except as a strange and vivid piece of my childhood, the kind of memory you eventually file away as something that belonged to a particular place and a particular grandmother, not something that could follow you into a rented apartment with modern radiators and no stove to speak of. I was standing in my kitchen one evening, washing a single plate after a meal eaten alone, when I heard it. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Coming, unmistakably, from somewhere behind the refrigerator, in a building that had stood for maybe 30 years, in a city that had never known the name Verbolozy, in a life that had nothing whatsoever to do with the old wooden houses and their old wooden guardians. I stood very still with the water running over my hands, and I did not feel afraid, which surprised me more than the sound itself. What I felt instead, arriving all at once the way understanding sometimes does, was something closer to recognition, The same recognition I'd once seen cross my grandmother's face the night I told her about the weight on my chest. Except now I was on the other side of it. He hadn't stayed behind in that house on the Uzhanka River. He had never belonged to the house at all. Not really. He belonged to us, to the line of women who fed him and feared him, and, eventually, learned to speak his old language back to him. And he had simply been waiting, patiently, through every year I hadn't thought of him, for the moment I finally had a threshold of my own to guard. I turned off the tap. I found, in the bottom of a kitchen drawer I never used, a stub of bread left over from that evening's dinner, and I set it on a small dish by the door, the way I had watched my grandmother do 1,000 times, without ever once being taught the words for why. And that night, for the first time since I was 8 years old, I slept without a lamp burning in the corner of the room, because the knocking, once so frightening, had finally become again what it had always secretly been underneath the fear: the sound of someone keeping watch. They used to tell us that every house has someone living in it besides the people who pay for it. I believe that now the way my grandmother believed it, not as a story passed down for its charm, but as something closer to memory, something I carry the way she carried it, the way I suppose I'll pass it on myself one day, to whoever eventually inherits the sound behind my own walls.